photographs when she suddenly heard a faint, indistinct whisper behind her. The voice, soft yet foreboding, said, "Save yourself." Lucy shivered with fear and immediately turned around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced and an unsettling feeling coursed through her body. Quickly she returned to the living room where the rest of her family was sitting with Mrs. Margaret. Her face was pale and her gaze was anxious. Forcing a smile, she said, "I think it's time we stopped troubling Mrs. Margaret. We should leave now." As Lucy tried to convince her family to leave the house, Lucia, the youngest daughter, eagerly insisted on staying longer with Mrs. Margaret. Mrs. Margaret, whose gentle demeanor and wistful eyes reflected memories of her own lost daughter, asked the family to let Lucia stay a little longer. The family, especially Austin, the father, agreed to the request. Lucy was the only one who vehemently objected, but under Austin's calm persuasion, she reluctantly gave in. Lucia remained with Mrs. Margaret for a few more hours. After the others left, Margaret and Lucia went to Margaret's bedroom to tidy up a bit. Mrs. Margaret asked Lucia to take clothes out of some boxes and organize them in the closet. While Margaret was arranging books on the table, her eyes fell on the framed photograph that Lucy had been staring at earlier. The frame had shifted slightly out of place, and the sight made her pause in thought. She was concerned about Lucy's strange behavior, but chose not to say anything. Lucia carefully transferred the old, slightly musty clothes into the closet. Suddenly, a small piece of paper fell from the pocket of one of the worn garments. It was a yellowed, crumpled paper with an odd word scrawled in dark, ink-black writing. Curious, Lucia picked it up and tried to read the word aloud. Before she could even pronounce it, Mrs. Margaret rushed over, snatched the paper from her hand, and, with a face full of fear, said, "Never repeat this word." Lucia, startled and slightly frightened, remained silent. Margaret, visibly shaken, carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her dress pocket. 2 hours passed swiftly after that, and Lucia eventually returned home. Her family greeted her warmly, but Lucy still felt a deep sense of unease. Hours after midnight, the house was steeped in a heavy silence. Everyone was asleep when Lucia suddenly woke up. She felt an odd sensation, as if something in her room had moved. A faint, whispering sound came from inside her wardrobe, a soft, low murmur, almost like a chant. Terrified, she sat up in her bed, her small hands trembling as she called out for her mother. "Mom! Mom!" Lucy awoke in a panic and rushed to her daughter's room. When she opened the door, the faint sound from the wardrobe continued, but abruptly stopped as she entered. Lucy, her heart pounding, approached the wardrobe, grasped the handle tightly, and slowly opened the door. When Lucy reached Lucia's room, she found her daughter hiding under the covers, clutching the blanket tightly over her head. Lucy's heart raced as she knelt beside the bed and gently pulled the blanket down to see Lucia's tear-streaked, frightened face. In a soft voice, she asked, "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" But before Lucia could respond, a loud noise erupted from the wardrobe, followed by the voice of a girl, filled with anger and hatred, almost a whisper, yet brimming with menace. "I will kill you!" The color drained from Lucy's face. Without thinking, she grabbed Lucia's small hand and bolted out of the room. Her heart pounded in her ears, and as soon as they were safe in the hallway, they ran straight into Austin, who stood groggily, his face filled with confusion. Breathless, Lucy tried to explain what had happened, the terrifying sound from the wardrobe. Austin's expression was skeptical, doubt etched across his features. "It's just a nightmare," he said firmly, but with a tinge of worry. "You must be imagining things." But Lucy's fear was raw and palpable. She felt the chilling presence of something unnatural in those words, but Austin dismissed it as the overactive imagination of a young mother in a new house. However, the story didn't end there. Somehow, word reached Mrs. Margaret. When she learned of the incident, a visible shudder ran through her. Her reaction was immediate and full of dread, a deep fear she struggled to conceal. Yet she kept her distance, refusing to get involved. "It's probably just the fantasies of a young family in an old house," she muttered under her breath, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. She said nothing further and avoided any conversations with Lucy and Austin, as if speaking about the matter would awaken something she feared. A week passed. The house returned to its heavy silence, the incident of that night seemingly forgotten. Yet the air remained thick, and the shadow of that night lingered in every corner. Then, one night, as darkness smothered the house like a suffocating blanket, Lucia's behavior took a terrifying turn. Lucy and Austin had just drifted off to sleep when they heard the faint sound of their bedroom door creaking open. Austin stirred first, thinking it might be the wind or the usual creaks of an old house. But then, in the dim light, he saw a small figure standing in the doorway. It was Lucia, her eyes wide open but empty, as though staring at something far beyond them. Her face was pale and emotionless. Without a word, she moved forward, her steps slow and deliberate, as if guided by an unseen force. Before they could react, Lucia reached their bed. Moving unnervingly, she raised her small hand and placed it firmly around Lucy's neck. Then, with sudden, merciless intensity, she began to press. Her small, cold fingers dug into Lucy's skin. In that moment, Lucia's face contorted, and her mouth opened, but the voice that came out was no longer her own. It was a harsh, cold voice that didn't belong to her. "You will die. I will kill you." Lucy woke up with a gasp, her trembling hands grasping at her daughter's small fingers. As she stared into Lucia's eyes, eyes that were cold, distant, almost devoid of recognition, Austin, snapping out of his shock, lunged forward and pulled Lucia away. In that instant it was as though a spell, if that's what it was, had broken. Lucia's face softened. She blinked, her eyes filling with tears, and suddenly burst into sobs, as if realizing what she had done. Lucy, still paralyzed with fear, held her daughter tightly, rocking her gently despite the terror that gripped her. Lucy, now deeply suspicious of Mrs. Margaret, the enigmatic elderly neighbor, decided to confront her. Mrs. Margaret, with her mysterious glances and half-spoken words, had always given Lucy an uneasy feeling. Without hesitation, Lucy rushed to her home and poured out everything: the chilling sounds of the night, the inexplicable attack by Lucia, and the shadowy presence Austin had seen. Mrs. Margaret initially tried to maintain her composure, but as Lucy recounted the details, her face turned pale and her words faltered. Finally, with a tremor in her voice, she said, "Bring Lucia to me. I need to see her." When Mrs. Margaret entered Lucy's home and saw Lucia, a deep sorrow and anxiety settled on her face. It was clear that she knew something she had kept hidden until now. Her expression was burdened with guilt and apprehension. She instructed Lucy to step away and asked that all the lights in the house be turned off. Though clearly terrified, Lucy had no choice but to comply. Mrs. Margaret knelt before Lucia and spoke gently but firmly. "Sit across from me, close your eyes, and stay calm," she instructed. Lucia obeyed, her voice faint and compliant. The room was engulfed in a heavy silence as Margaret took a deep breath and said with a commanding tone, "Whoever you are, speak to me. Show yourself." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly the entire house seemed to tremble. A faint, eerie sound, like distant wailing, echoed from the walls. Lucia twitched slightly, her expression began to change, and the color of her eyes darkened. Her face took on an unsettling, lifeless expression, and a voice, no longer her own, emerged from deep within her. "You called for me. Now I'm here." Margaret's eyes locked firmly onto Lucia's. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Leave this family. They have nothing to do with you." The entity controlling Lucia laughed, a venomous and bone-chilling sound. "What I want from this family is the same thing I wanted from yours. You cannot stop me." Margaret's face contorted in a mix of anger and fear. She began reciting prayers under her breath, her voice shaking but resolute. Suddenly, an unseen force hurled her backward with alarming violence, sending her crashing to the floor. She let out a sharp cry before a deathly silence descended upon the room. Lucy, paralyzed with fear, watched as Margaret slowly sat up, trembling but alive. The room remained dark and still, the oppressive atmosphere suffocating. Whatever malevolent force had taken hold of their lives was far from done, and its presence loomed heavier than ever.